Welcome, everyone. So we still have a few people who are signing in. My name is Ellie Bass, and welcome. We are diving into a JFI event, which we haven't had a chance to do in a little while. So welcome, everyone. I run something here in Toronto called the Jewish Family Institute. It's the Yad Nashman Jewish Family Institute, or the JFI, as many of you know it. And really, this organization was built to try to provide ways for people to connect to their Jewish community around common issues and common goals. And really using different types of wisdom, psychology, science, cutting edge ideas, and melding those together with Jewish wisdom and Torah in order to provide a very well-rounded and holistic way to address some of the things that we care about the most as a community. So tonight, I'm absolutely so thrilled and excited to welcome David Weitzner. He has written what is now one of my favorite books, and I'll show you. You'll know it's a favorite book because of how many stickies generally end up in the book. So that is usually a really good sign. And the name of the book, you can't quite see it because of my stickies, is Connected Capitalism. And the tagline is How Jewish Wisdom Can Transform Work. So I was so happy that we came across each other. I want to say a little bit about David before we begin. And then we're going to just jump right in. We're going to talk, we're going to, kibitz a little bit back and forth. And then at the end of our talk, we're going to open it up for questions. I think you'll find that what David is talking about is especially relevant right now to our experience of work, to our experience of purposefulness. And so we really want to give all of you an opportunity to dive in whatever way you'd like. Okay, so David, I'm going to read the bio because I can barely remember my own phone number, never mind read a bio off by heart. So here we go. So David Weitzner is at heart a philosopher who briefly became a music industry executive. I have to tell you, that's one of the things I've been fangirling over is some of the people he knows in the music industry. You can ask him about that later. And he's since spent nearly 2 decades in business schools, currently is an assistant professor in the School of Administrative Studies at York University. His work has appeared in popular media outlets, including The Forward, Tablet Magazine, Spirituality and Health, Quillette, Financial Post Magazine, and the National Post, Chabad.org, and the Big Ideas television program. He's an active consultant for a number of religious and educational institutions and teacher to hundreds of university students each year. So you can find more information about David at davidweitzner.com. And to find a copy of his book, you can go to amazon.com or .ca, depending on where you live. I highly recommend getting a copy. So I am going to just crack it open. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Ellie. That was awesome.
I got to do my due. We got to make sure we know who we're talking to because
fair enough.
Genuinely unassuming that people don't understand what depth and breadth you are bringing to the table with this book. So I'm really excited that we get a chance to talk. So tell me how you got to this book. Why, what is it that you do and what need were you seeing?
Yeah, so I'm a business prof. I've been doing that for the better part of 2 decades. And really, this book was born out of my last book. So my last book was 15 Paths. And the summary of that book was a disillusioned business professor, that was me, who decides to reach out to his artistic heroes for some guidance. And so I spent a year talking to my musical influences to try and make sense of the world. I was sort of, lost and not so happy with the intellectual ideas that were being shared in the business school. And I thought, they're artists, but they're also really successful entrepreneurs, all of these folks. And I thought I would have a lot to learn from them. And indeed, I did. And we were doing an event at Rough Trade in New York City with me and Lee Ronaldo of Sonic Youth and Nelson Klein from Wilco. And we were talking about the improvisational experience that musicians have. And Nell said something that sort of really blew my mind, right? He said, he views what he does as an extension of a lost cultural experience. What's a cultural experience? He said, we used to come together in church and sit silently and sing together. We wouldn't talk, we turn our brains off, right? and we would just feel together. And that was the ultimate experience. And I thought, that's cool and interesting. And we have something similar in our tradition around, for Farbrengen. But I was never a singer. That wasn't where my heart was. My heart was always in the yeshiva, really, in the shtibel, doing chavrusa, the one-on-one learning. And I think of the amazing chavrusas I had over the years, Dr. Yitzchak Bloch, Emil Fackenheim, and my mentor, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi. And I thought, this has informed my worldview more than anything else. And when I started to, reassess what I talk about in the business school and in the consulting field, I realized it was inextricably tied to chavrusa, to mitzvah. And I felt like I was, with my last book, I was not being fully honest because I was trying to present the ideas in a more universal sort of language. And to me, the language I speak, for better or worse, is a Jewish language. And my approach to strategic thinking, for better or worse, is Jewish. And so I wanted to write this book to put out the idea that if you find what I'm doing interesting in any way, know that the roots of it are Jewish. And no matter what your religion is or no religion at all, or what your cultural orientation is or none at all, if you really want to get strategy as I understand it, you got to dive into Jewish concepts. And that's what connected capitalism is. Connected capitalism is not an attempt to proselytize. It's saying these are the roots of my thinking, and these are the ideas that informed my very secular worldview. And my hope with this book is to normalize ideas like mitzvah and chavrusa, because they're wild concepts that have no peer. And there's nothing wrong with being a little ethnocentric every now and again and saying, you know what, our culture has something to say on this topic, and it's worth diving into it. And so that's the origin of the book. And now it's out in the world during a period where it's not so easy to stand up and normalize Jewish ideas or Jewish wisdom or Jewish voices, which is going to be interesting.
Yeah,
it's going to be
absolutely. Yeah. What did you see? You mentioned that you recognized something was missing in the business world. What did you see was missing? What was the gap that you were trying to address?
They weren't turning me on. I wasn't excited. I found that we're saying the same thing in a rather uninteresting way. And I'll say it like this. I'll say, we're living in something of a revolutionary moment, right? Right now, the loudest voices are those voices who are pushing to overthrow a lot of the existing institutions. And, as someone in a business school who believes in capitalism, I know that I'm of a minority voice pushing against these revolutionary tides. And when I was listening to my colleagues and their defense of capitalism, I found it utterly uncompelling. And so I thought,
like the idea of disruption, like everything is about disruption.
Everything is being disrupted. Well, it is being disrupted wholeheartedly, and if we are going to defend these institutions, we need to A, think about how we're going to reform them. And B, we have to come up with a compelling argument other than, well, it's my money and I like it, And so I thought the artist took me halfway there, because that was what was really amazing about the experience. What was amazing about the experience is, like we did an event in San Francisco, right, with Sunshine Jones from Dub Tribe Sound System, and he was out stumping for Bernie. But when someone asked him a question about socialism, he said, look, I believe in capitalism. I believe in hard work. I believe in building something and innovating. And I thought that was amazing. And that's the sort of voice I wanted to center and empower. But where I returned to the Jewish thinking was I came to the realization that if capitalism isn't a spiritual enterprise, then it doesn't deserve to continue. And I believe our tradition says it can be and is a spiritual enterprise, right? Judaism clearly believes that the holy experience is found in the day-to-day. You go to work and you're holy. It's not when you meditate on the mountain. It's when you do the things that you do in your day-to-day. And that's interesting. That's a novel take, I think that if we're going to reform these institutions, they need to be spiritual. They need to be wonder-inducing. They need to be disrupted. And it needs to be done from a thoughtful place. And that's really what motivated me, Ellie.
I think it's so interesting when you say capitalism and spirituality in the same sentence. I think most of us would think about those words as utterly separate and, you know, mutually exclusive in a heavy way. So how so maybe let's crack this open a little bit in terms of, you use very specific words and language in your book around what work means and what spirituality means. So maybe can we start with work? You know, you use some very specific words for work. How do you describe that in your book?
Well, let's say what work isn't, right? What I say in the book is that work isn't passive adherence, which is to say that going to work doesn't mean punching the clock. It doesn't mean doing what my boss tells me to do. It doesn't mean, you know, tying myself to the grind. Because if that's what it is, it's not going to last. It's not going to be something that will allow you to innovate. It's not going to be something that will excite you. Now, I understand we have to go to work to put food on the table. I recognize that. But if work is going to be something meaningful and exciting in a way that's antithetical to the Marxist revolution, right? If we don't want workers to rise up and fight back, it's because we've made them partners in co-creation. And I think that's what's interesting. What's interesting is the idea of saying, when I go to work to co-create, no matter where I am on the hierarchy. So it's not that the hierarchy isn't there. I might be a front office staff member. I might be a mid-level manager. I may not need to be the CEO, but if work is meaningful, it's co-creative, it's cooperative, it's transformative. And, you know, I push this idea because it's rooted strongly in data. So what's the data? So we know two things about millennials, right? The first thing we know about millennials is 70% of them, 70% say that they will leave their job if they don't find fulfillment. That money is the least important thing. Mm-hmm. And the same study found that the vast majority of them have left their job within the past 2 years. So that's interesting, piece number one. Mm-hmm. Second is that within the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to be the vast majority of the workplace. So we have to care about them, right? So the notion that work is simply where you draw a paycheck, where your boss tells you what to do, where you punch the clock and, you know, kill that part of yourself, that might have worked in generations past. It's not sustainable. It's not going to work. If we want millennials to stay at our firms, which we will need to want to do, we have to change what we think about work. So the younger generation in many ways is driving this, that it's not just a pie in the sky sort of idealism, but it's wrestling with a real world problem, which is the day where the majority of workers are happy to be controlled and told what to do for a paycheck is happily over. And that's still capitalism, by the way. You know, that's still consistent with the sort of capitalism I believe in, which is the holders of capital empowering the people that work for them in ways that all parties find fulfilling, co-creative, transformative, and innovative driven, you know, and that's exciting.
I think that's so important too, because for me, you know, part of my coaching when I work with people is this idea of, when you ask people what their goal is, so often it isn't about their salary. So often their goal is, I want this to feel meaningful. I want this to feel, I want to get up in the morning and be excited for my day. Mm-hmm. And how do you accomplish that in some way? And I agree with you. More and more people that I'm seeing are saying it doesn't have to do so much with the paycheck. It has to do with feeling like what I do makes a difference. And how do we speak to that? Because I agree with you. So there's so much of the narrative around millennials, like, oh, they just want a trophy and to be happy all the time. You know, how do we reconcile that? Because I feel like millennials have gotten that bad rap. But when you say they're about to be the majority of the workforce and we have to figure out how to speak to this, so what are the 3 things that you start to introduce that start to address that desire for something more?
Right. So, you know, I define spirituality in the book in a very specific way. It's not necessarily metaphysical. It doesn't necessarily use God language. It's in fact rooted in 3 ideas: meaning, connection, and wonder. And those are the pillars of a spiritual experience. So if you want to bring spirituality into the workforce, You need to find meaning, connection, and wonder. And what's interesting is each of those pieces on its own is rather uncontroversial. Lots of data already exists on why you need purpose, why we're better off if we're together. Lots of stuff in the innovation literature about why curiosity matters, right? But what's novel is bringing them together in an iterative process. This idea that I'm going on the hunt for meaning in a way that goes beyond the current trend towards mindfulness. Because it's not enough to just meditate. It's not enough for me to go to a meditation room and chill on my own. I got to come out of that and connect with the people I'm working with, whether they're my customers, my coworkers, whatever it may be, the community at large. But that itself isn't enough. That connection has to be driven by something more as well. And that's that sense of wonder. And then once you have that sense of wonder in play, right? What's the psychological definition of wonder is the feeling that your paradigm is broken, that I'm trying to make sense of a data point and I can't fit it into my current sense-making tools. That's wonder. And so once you've got there, by definition, you have to hunt for meaning again because your paradigm is now broken.
So you're consistently moving through this cycle.
That's right.
Of looking
That's right.
for meaning, and then how does that have connection? How does that move you to wonder? And then that causes you to ask the next question.
Back to meaning, and then new connections, and hopefully wonder again. And that's spirituality. That's Jewish spirituality. And it's exciting, like somebody read the first chapter of my book, which had the story of Moses and Buddha, the contrast between the two. And he asked me, he said, so I got to ask you something. I don't understand this. He said, if you have to summarize in a sentence what Jewish contribution might be to the workspace, where do you get that out of the story of Moses? And the story of Moses in the book is the story of him hitting the rock. And I said, that is the point. And he said, I don't get it, right? How can you tell me the hero of your Bible disobeyed God, made God angry, threw a tantrum, hit a stone that he was supposed to talk to, and that's your story of that's the Jewish wisdom? I said, yeah, that is the Jewish wisdom. That Jewish wisdom is this idea that even the most humble man, even the biblical hero Moses, didn't listen to God, threw a fit, hit a stone, and we're supposed to learn from that. And that's antithetical to the serene Buddha. Again, and I'm not knocking that tradition, right? There's a time and space to be a serene Buddha, and it's not in the workplace. In the workplace, it's where we break things and smash things and throw tantrums sometimes, but in a controlled way, in the sense that it's rooted in connection. It's rooted in bringing people closer. So if I'm hitting the stone out of anger, or I'm hitting the stone because I want to distance myself from people, or I'm hitting the stone because I want to do it on my own, that's a failure. But Moses hit the stone because he wanted to bring the people in. They were thirsty and they were impatient, and the rock wasn't giving the water fast enough. So he hit the stone because he said, this is the way I'm going to teach them. And this is the way we're going to be brought together. And this is going to be wonder. And there's an idea, my friend, Rabbi Tzvi Freeman, he's a Rabbi Chabad, he's the writer of Chabad.org. He taught me this idea, which I like a lot, which is in the Jewish tradition, God prefers in its original sense that you don't sin. He said, okay, fine. But the Jewish story is one of constant sinning. And what's really cool in the idea of tshuva is God says, okay, you screwed up. And so man says, okay, well, what do I do now? And God says, I don't know. I wrote you a script. You didn't follow it. So now you're here. And man says, so what do I do? You're the one who screwed up. You figure out what you do next. And that's it. And I love that idea, right? I love the idea that in Jewish thinking, it's, okay, here's the script. Great. You can stay on it. Wonderful. 99% of us can't. Moshe couldn't. Avram couldn't, right? What do I do now? God says, I don't know. It's your mistake. You figure it out. And that's
but there's also something within the system that provides for people to figure it out, right? It's not a system that closed that says you have to go outside of the system to figure it out. And I think that's such a powerful paradigm, as you said, for a workspace where there's, if you can be in a workspace where there's tremendous room to fall off script, where there's tremendous room to have error, and have that, all of that go into a an environment of productivity is such an interesting paradigm, because, you know, most of the experience of work is I have to be perfect. I have to be on the ball. I have to be on time. I have to stick to the script. And that's what's going to drive us forward. Which points me to a question, which is you use a very specific word in the book that was driving me crazy when I was reading. And I wonder if you could just expand on it. So you use a very specific word that work needs to be reactive. And from my training and my background, like I always think like reactive is actually supposed to be responsive. Like when we're reactive, we're not really thinking. So
Right.
why do you use the word reactive instead of responsive?
Right. I use the word reactive because I want you to bring your whole self to the moment. Responsive suggests a limitation, right? Reactive says, I'm going to look inside my being and I'm going to react. And there's a risk in reacting. But because I believe that work takes place as life takes place in a communal context, in a context of connection, I can react because I can trust that the people around me will be keeping me in line, that the responsive element will come from outside. So my reaction isn't out of control. If you just have reaction as a driver of meaning in isolation, you're in trouble. But in the context of a collective whole, right? I want to react. I want to bring myself. I want to bring my feelings. And then maybe someone will talk me down, or maybe someone will redirect me, or maybe someone will pick up the pieces after I smash them, right? So it's working together to get there. And
so are you saying like reactivity has within it passion somehow? Like it has.
I wanted that language. You know, when I was playing around with the words, a lot of the pushback that I got on reaction was that it sounds childlike, that a child reacts, whereas a mature, thoughtful adult responds. And when I got that critique, I thought, yeah, that's great. Precisely. I want you to tap into that childlike sense, not childish, right? Not act in a childish manner, but retain that childlike sense of reacting in your full, natural, whole being. That's where things get interesting. And I'm comfortable saying that because, again, you're not doing it in isolation. So research on curiosity in the workplace, right? They talk about this. They say, what do we need in order to have a work environment actually be innovative, really be learning driven and curiosity driven? And what the literature says is you need to do two things at once. You need a culture where everyone feels safe. So if you fully feel safe to be emotive, to be expressive, right? Then you'll explore curiosity in an interesting way. At the same time, a safe culture has to be one where criticism is harsh and precise and continuous. And, you know, there's limited tolerance for wayward behavior. So you're allowed to screw up, but then you have to hear the criticism, take it and adopt. You know, you asked before about millennials being viewed as entitled, right? And that speaks to it. So to the extent that a millennial mindset is, I want to bring my whole being to work, we have to make space for that. To the extent the millennial mindset says, you know what, I'm not going to work 7 days a week. You know, they say at Google, they only expect you to be productive 3 days a week. That's fine. The flip side is you're actually held to a very high standard. The flip side is because I'm allowing you to bring your true self, because I'm letting you emote, because we trust each other, that's a two-way street. And the other side of that street is you're going to listen to my feedback. You're going to listen to what I say. You're going to listen to the group, not in a hierarchical way, right? In an equal way. And that's what Moshe, according at least to Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, was trying to do with the stone. Moshe thought in spiritual terms. If I talk to the rock, that's symbolically teaching that, you know, wisdom will just come. You can listen, you can get it. But if I hit the rock, that means you have to go out and work for it. Well, how are we going to do this? How are the Jewish people going to go out and work? They're going to work together. So on the one hand, there's uncertainty, right? On the other hand, it's empowering. On the one hand, I'm going to have to do it, right? I can't trust it'll come from above. On the other hand, we'll be closer if we work together at the end. That makes sense?
Yeah, I really think that's so interesting too, because it creates responsibility on both sides.
Yes.
A sense of agency and responsibility. I'm going to shape it the way I need it to be, but then I'm also responsible for producing what you want produced. Like there's a real back and forth there that's so interesting. It's a very different hierarchy dynamic.
That's right. And it's something I hear from a lot of folks who get that. You know, one of the people I interview in my book is Roddy Burkett. He's a puppeteer. He's a genius guy. And, you know, his last show really blew my mind because he gave the puppets to the audience. And I remember when I asked him about this, you know, I said, how were you able to do that? And he told me an amazing story. He said, you know, when I first presented it, my manager, all my people said, we can't do this. These Roddy Burkett puppets, each one's worth a few $100s. We can't hand it to the random people. How do we know they're not going to steal it? They're not going to break it. They're not going to be responsible. And Ronnie was like, because they won't. And his colleagues were like, well, what do you mean? How do you do that? And he said, because I'm going to look him in the eye and I'm going to hand him that puppet. And by looking them in the eye, they're going to know two things, right? They're going to know we're connected. You can feel safe. And now that you feel safe, you have a responsibility. So feeling safe with me means I'm trusting you. And me trusting you means you're not going to screw this up. And he did this show a couple hundred times. So thousands of people went through. No one stole the puppets. No one broke the puppets. He was right. You know, despite all the fears, he was right. Because
sorry, give us an example of what that would look like in a work environment. Can you, because if we can't see it, we can't be it. So what could that even look like?
I think the Google work schedule is a perfect example of that, right? If I were to say, I'm your manager, I'm your supervisor, okay? I only expect you to be productive 3 days a week. So half the week, I'm entrusting you to go off site, to go out of my supervision, to not be accountable, right? But you are accountable because you're going to produce. So if you don't produce, you're out, because I'm not going to switch to the old system of command and control. If you prove yourself irresponsible, I'm not going to have you in the office 6 days a week. I'm not going to sit over you and watch you. No, that's not happening. I'm trusting you with the freedom. And in turn, you're going to produce. So those are the choices, right? And I think, you know, there are work environments where that's happening, and it's beautiful. There are work environments where managers are afraid to do that, and it's inefficient, right? They think they're being efficient, but they're not. Because in this day and age, having someone stare at you, stare over at you, know, doesn't inspire you, doesn't allow you to innovate. You know, even as a teacher, I see it, right? In the university, you know, environment, I will not have our exams proctored the way they were proctored in my day, right? So in my day, I would sit down and there'd be 10 proctors in the room, and they'd walk up and down and they'd look over you. And that was intimidating, you know, and I wasn't my best. So I write the exam. When I write an exam, when I craft the test, I craft it from the perspective, okay, I'm going to assume the students are going to cheat. Okay, that's going to be my starting point. And then I'm going to write this exam saying, okay, now that I assume you're cheating, what does that exam look like so that I'm still getting the best out of you? Because I don't want to proctor you. I don't want to stand over you. I don't want to walk the room. So I'm going to instead empower you to produce in a way that gives you the freedom, but also still creates boundaries so that there's a legitimate assessment.
So even if they are quote unquote cheating, they're actually still having to think and do the work.
That's right. And that's what Google does. What Google does very well is when you think you're slacking off, you're not slacking off, right? Because if you're within a culture and a framework that brings the best out of you and recognizes that, you know, part of work is not working, you're not slacking off. You're doing what you need to do to be more effective. And workplaces that view downtime as slacking off are the ones that are in fact less productive, because it's the wrong term to understand it.
So I guess that speaks to Shabbat.
Beautifully so. Beautifully so. You know, I talk about it in the book, and I'd love to schmooze with you about it, get your thoughts. But what I think is really unique about Shabbos in the Jewish tradition, unlike other meditative traditions where being and restfulness comes first, in the Jewish tradition, work comes first, right? Shabbos isn't the first day, it's the seventh day. You need to earn it. And we model God in that sense, right? God worked for 6 days, then came Shabbos. First, you do the work. First, you achieve something, then you breathe. And that's a wild and culturally unique idea, because in every other spiritual tradition that I know of, you start by being. You start by resting. you start, and that motivates you to then go out and work. We say, and I'll use the language, sorry, react, get out there, smash things, do stuff. Now come down after you've earned it.
That's so beautiful. In fact, our sages actually say, like, it's not really Shabbos if you didn't spend the week creating, that you don't get the full effect of what that feeling is of stopping unless you've been going.
Right. That's right. And when folks, even now in the secular world, have embraced this idea, Tiff Schlein, who is Jewish and pushed the idea in her book 24/6 about the technology Shabbos, right? Which is a brilliant idea. And it's similar. It's not saying reject technological devices. It's not a Luddite orientation. It's saying you've used the technology for 6 days. Amazing. You've socialized, you've tweeted, you've TikToked, right? You've done it all. Now turn off, breathe, become yourself, then get back at it.
Oh, it's beautiful. So do you find, you mentioned in the book this experience that people are having of mindfulness, quote unquote, where they are turning off, say for a few minutes at work, where they'll go, you give this great story. Maybe you can tell it over where, this guy has a room that they are supposed to go to meditate, but he ends up having a meeting in there. So what happens there, and why is this story important? Because I feel like now this speaks to what we're talking about, where there has to be some conversation between work and rest.
Right. It was wild, right? So Google has these gorgeous, mind-blowing meditation rooms, okay? And he went in there to make a phone call because that was the space and headspace he wanted to be in when he interacted with someone. Colleagues looked at him and said, "What are you doing? You're ruining my vibe, right? I'm in here to meditate. I'm going to make the phone call outside." And he said, "Oh, okay. Am I doing it wrong?" Right? But I don't think he was doing it wrong, right? I think he came from that perspective of recognizing that there isn't a contradiction between interacting, between connection, between doing, and the restfulness and the peacefulness that a meditation room is supposed to encourage. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we so often think like in order to have a certain presence of mind, we have to stop doing everything that we're doing. And you're right. So much of Judaism is about like, just say a blessing before you eat that apple, but we're not asking you to sit down and meditate for 45 minutes before you do that. We're just saying while you're in motion, you can find touch points of presence in some way.
That's right. And it's beautiful for those who can. There are some Hasidic folks who, will literally do a Dveikus exercise for 45 minutes before they start davening. And then their davening itself is 2 hours and they wrap themselves in the talis and that's beautiful, right? Wonderful. But that's not what most of Jewish life is. Most of Jewish life is very much noisy, in the moment, interactive. You're very present. When you go into a shtibel, right? A shtibel is not quiet. The kids are free, they're running around, and that's the energy we want. It was controversial even to create this hierarchy of a pulpit and a rabbi in front. And, most of the rabbis who I'm friends with sit in the back. They sit with their people. They don't want to sit up front. Not to knock those who sit up front, right? That's an approach too, but it's not the way necessarily.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So when we go from say, I wanted to open up a little bit more about this idea of wonder. I think that, when people hear the word wonder, sometimes, again, it sounds a bit like a child experience, not necessarily something that we have at work. So how do you approach wonder and curiosity in a place of business, like where you're just supposed to be getting stuff done? What does that look like?
So wonder is, I think, most business people's blind spot. I think when you talk to your average business individual, they understand purpose. That's part of their day-to-day. They understand connection. That's part of their day-to-day. Wonder is the piece that they're not actively pursuing, but they do through different names, because what I'll call wonder, someone else will call innovation. Someone else might call it a technology mindset. Someone else might call it a learning mindset, right? But wonder is just, wow, That's wonder. Or silent, like I have no words. That's wonder. And that's critical in my mind for keeping the other things spinning, right? So if you know what your purpose is and you have no questions and you're absolutely convinced of your rightness, that's a type of meaning without wonder, and it's not very interesting, okay? Similarly, right? If you have connections and you say, you know what, I'm good. I don't need to know anyone more. I don't need to love anyone more. I don't need to expand my family. Okay, people do that. But again, that's connection without wonder. Wonder is the piece that keeps you driving forward. And when spoken as such, I think it's funny, in my book, originally, I wanted to call it awe. I wanted it to be meaning, connection, and awe.
Yeah, again, I was wondering why you didn't use that word, because so often in our Jewish liturgy, certain things are translated as awe. When we think of the high holidays, it's the days of awe. And awe is very much something that we pursue in our personal practice as Jews and in our communal practice. So yeah, why not that word?
So interestingly, the reason is because of the marketing folks. So the marketing folks did some workshops with individuals, and people were really turned off by the word awe. Why? Because to the average individual, awe to them suggests there's an angry man in the sky, and I'm afraid of him, and I'm in awe of him. Awe had a connotation of fear, which people didn't like. So I looked on my bookshelf and I saw Abraham Joshua Heschel's I Asked for Wonder. And I'm like, okay, there we go. And it's funny because it's something that I argue with folks to this day, right? A perfect example is Yira. A lot of folks translate Yira as fear. So Yira Shamayim, they translate as fear of heaven. And that's wrong. Actually, Yira should be translated as awe, and awe should be understood without the fear aspect. So Yira Shamayim is more, wow, there's something bigger than me. Wow, there's something more out there, right? I would, not just me, there are other folks who make the argument that, tying fear and awe together is one of the biggest errors of translation that contemporary Judaism has done. And we'd be better off if we use the word awe to translate Yira instead of fear, and recognize that awe is more a mix of wonder and curiosity without the element of fear. Fear doesn't loom large in the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, I love that too, because wonder does have more of a curiosity flavor to it. And I think curiosity is so compelling.
Yeah, my late mentor, Reb Zalman, it was something that I would argue with him a lot on this topic, because we both agreed that Yira is awe. But he thought that therefore he had to remove from the liturgy any of these outdated concepts, right? So in his siddur, he took out Melech, because he said Melech, as understood back then, was a king who you feared. And in the contemporary mindset, that doesn't speak to us. So I'm going to remove it from the liturgy. And I didn't need that. For me, I still daven out of a traditional siddur. Right. I'm comfortable with the word Melech because I'm comfortable with Melech in a more contemporary context, right? Which is to say that it's just trying to use words where I don't have words, right? So I'm using the words Lord and Master and King because I don't have a word, right? It's more about, but it doesn't instill in me a fear of a dude who's going to behead me if I go astray. But where Reb Zalman and I, of course, agreed was that is the wrong mindset, and Reb Zalman was comfortable because he was Reb Zalman, going that far and saying that this is important. But, he was taught by the Frierdiker Rebbe, by the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That was his close and that was the philosophy instilled in him in Old World Hasidus. This idea that fear is a foreign concept to Judaism. Fear was brought in from other traditions. Our tradition is not about fear. There's respect, there's boundaries, there's wonder, but it's sense making. I love the Hasidic reading of the Adam and Eve story. I write about it in the book, but I'll share it because I think it's just amazing. So in the Hasidic reading of Adam and Eve, Eve took the apple, right? And the snake said, if you eat it, God will kill you. You should be afraid to do that. And Eve said, really? Because if that's the case, that's not the God I want to have. That's not the world I want to live in. And so Eve ate the apple in a moment of rebellion, not to break the rules, but to show clearly that love transcends fear. And she was right. And in fact, that was the lesson that her son learned, right? Initially, the punishment for killing his brother, he thought was going to be death. And he negotiated with God. He said, wait, can't I wander instead? And can't I do this? And God said, yeah. And, again, in the Hasidic story, it ends with, that's why you don't see Adam again in the story after this happened, because Adam didn't get it. Adam comes back and he's like, wait, why is my wife still alive? She ate from the apple. Why isn't she dead? Why is my other son still alive? He murdered. Why is he dead? What do you mean they negotiated with God? I don't understand. And so Adam disappears from the narrative in the Hasidic reading because Adam had nothing to say. He had nothing to teach. But we learn from Eve, and we learn from Cain, and we learn from the other folks who broke the rules, pushed back, weren't motivated by fear, and we learn from them. And that's where our story continues. It's a beautiful, beautiful rendition.
It's gorgeous also. And it reminds me of, you have one chapter in your book called Elevating Forgiveness. And I really want to understand, what is the role of this curiosity and elevating forgiveness in a work environment? Because I know that is a very challenging thing to do when you're in a situation where you're trying to appear competent, when you're trying to appear professional, when you're trying to appear managerial and in control. What does this elevating forgiveness and curiosity look like in those situations?
Yeah, I think forgiveness is so important. And I'll just say two things real quick. So the boring answer is that the data supports forgiveness. I share some anecdotes in the book, and I have references we can go deeper. But time after time after time, when businesses forgive rather than punish, they do better over the long term. Fine, let's put that aside. Let's get to the more interesting piece, which is forgiveness in Judaism is different than forgiveness in psychology. Forgiveness in psychology says, why do I forgive? I forgive because the opposite of forgiveness is the anger I hold. And that anger is unhealthy. So I don't forgive for you. I don't forgive for the world. I don't forgive for relationships. I forgive because for me, my body needs it. That's a psychological sense of forgiveness. You forgive because you need a release. That's not the Jewish approach. The Jewish recognizes that there's different categories of forgiveness. There's mechila, there's slicha, right? There's these different ideas. And each one is meant to take you through a different process of connection, right? So there's one type of forgiveness that says, I'm forgiving you because you did your best to fix the world. So in other words, that forgiveness comes when I know that the world has changed and you're not going to do it again. And what's very interesting, is this sort of wiping the slate clean only happens from God, as it were, right? And he stays out of the picture. So, forgiveness is very human driven, right? You must come and apologize to the person who you want to forgive you. And you must show them that you've made changes to warrant that type of forgiveness. That's strategic. And I think that's what belongs in the workplace, right? A negotiated forgiveness that says, okay, I get that you can screw up and you're going to screw up. Okay. Now what happens? It's that same idea. You flip the script. What happens next? And I think that's very important. The other piece of forgiveness that I think is really important in the workplace is self-forgiveness. Because again, if we're talking about a philosophy of reaction, of empowering individuals, you will screw up. The individual will screw up. And you need to forgive yourself, not just because it feels good, but because you need to move on and you need to be motivated to think about how you're going to move on. And so I find forgiveness to be a really interesting strategic tool. And it's something that a lot of the artists I talk to speak about, because they recognize that, we live in an age that doesn't really have space for forgiveness, right? Cancel culture, if you will, is a manifestation of a culture that doesn't have space for forgiveness. No matter what you do, you're done after error number one. And, you know, the actor who I interviewed, Amelia Sargeson, right? She said, that doesn't make sense for her. She said, as an actress, she has to play horrible characters sometimes. And the only way she can do that is by going through a process of forgiveness, because to act well, you have to get in the mind of the individual you're trying to play. And so as a tool, she's developed techniques for negotiating forgiveness that I think we need in the business world. I think we need to think about how we can work with different parties. That doesn't mean everything is forgivable. Doesn't mean everyone should be forgiven at all times, right? There are boundary conditions. But we can't move forward without the possibility of forgiveness, starting with self-forgiveness. And much like mindfulness, we can't just let it be inward. We can't just let it be about release. It has to be reactive and strategic.
And I think that's so cool, because it means that the forgiveness piece isn't just about manners in the workplace. It's actually part of your process is being a responsible part of this project. Is that you let things, that you learn how to process this experience and move forward so everyone can move forward.
That's right. Which doesn't mean there aren't boundary conditions, right? And the boundary condition might be, I'm not speaking to you again, Ellie, right? Like, I can't look at you. I'll find a way to work with you, but I can't look at you. That's okay. But negotiate that and figure out what those boundary conditions are. Don't ignore it.
Beautiful. Yeah. So how do we see this looking? You know, one of the comments that you made was post-COVID, whatever that looks like. These are going to be some very important pieces of rebuilding the workspaces. So what do you think we're looking at in the post-COVID work world, and how do meaning, connection, and wonder play a part in that?
Yeah, the post-COVID work world is going to be a disaster in the near term, and the challenge of forgiveness is going to be difficult, certainly against our political class in the near term. However, we know it's going to happen, and we have to get there. So, you know, I wrote an article actually about 2 weeks ago that said step one in this is actually eye contact, getting back to the human. You know, one of the things that we've lost right now, right? We're on Zoom. I'm not looking you in the eye. I'm not connecting with you. We're not building trust, right? So if this were a work event, as it were, this collaboration, it's fun. I'm so glad we connected. But in the future, I hope we hold rooms together, because we'll work much better when we can see each other. And that's that idea of connection and wonder, et cetera. So, you know, folks are saying that the future after COVID is still going to be a Zoom future, because a lot of companies say, hey, I can save money. I don't have to buy office space. A lot of folks say, you know what, I like not commuting. I don't think that's going to happen. Or rather, it may happen in the near term, but not over the long term. We will have to return the humanness. So we will have to get together. We will have to work together face to face. And we will have to remember that, you know, our tools need to be an extension of ourselves. You know, you asked, you know, about wonder. And what's interesting about that question is, in the workspace, we often get confused. We wonder at our tools instead of with our tools. So a lot of folks have a sense of wonder when they look at the technological innovation. Oh my God, how do I do that? You know, Doug Rushkoff writes a lot about the fact that we're the first generation that don't understand at all the things that we use every day, right? So in the old days, right, you had a sense of how, the last generation, you had a sense of how a car worked, right? You understood basically what an engine was somewhat, right? You had a basic sense. You had a basic sense of how a typewriter, you had a basic sense of your tools. Today, we have no idea of how our tools. And so we want
like I could crack open an iPhone and figure out like how just by looking at it, figure out how it works.
That's right. And that's a problem, right? Because we should be using our tools to help us achieve wonder, i.e. the tools should be an extension of ourselves. So we should be using the tools to make us more human and build greater human connections, and not the other way around. You know, like Rushkoff writes a lot about the fact that, again, in the beginning of the internet, he contrasts message boards to texting. He said message boards were brilliant because it was a tool of connection on human time. So I had an idea, I typed it, went to bed. Next day, someone in Australia read it, thought about it, typed their answer, went to bed. 2 days later, I responded. Brilliant. Thoughtful connections across the globe, deep meaning, right? My phone beeps at 3 a.m. because someone in another time zone has an idea, okay? It wakes me up and I feel obligated to respond. That's not human time. That's not how the human brain works. That's the tool's time. That's the technology's time, right? And so really we have to push on this. Algorithms, right? Algorithms are going to be a huge, huge issue moving forward that we have not wrestled well with. An algorithm, people forget that an algorithm is only as good as its human programmer. It's an extension of the human thought that went into it.
Right.
And so if the human thought isn't ethical, if the human thought isn't wondrous, if the human thought isn't rooted in meaning and purpose, it's disastrous. In the book, I use the example of the Uber car that ran over a pedestrian, right? It's a fascinating example. How did that happen? The car hesitated for, I think it was 6 or 7 seconds.
Right. This is a self-driving car you're talking
self-driving
about.
car.
Right.
That's
that
right.
Is programmed.
That's right. It hesitated for 6 or 7 seconds, which is an eternity in computer time. Why? What was it wrestling with? Because it was programmed to avoid humans. But humans follow the law and they cross at crosswalks. Here was this woman jaywalking. So the computer didn't know what to make of it. The computer said, here's an entity. Don't know what it is. It's not a human because it's not at a crosswalk.
Right.
It's not an animal because it's too big. All right, I'm going to run it over, right? And that's what happened, you know?
Yeah, that's so interesting because I was reading something recently where somebody was saying 90% of all apps and platforms were created by men. All of the communication tools that we are using, Twitter, Facebook, all of those things were created by men, really with their picture of what communication looks like. And wouldn't it be interesting to see a communication platform that was created by women? And would we communicate differently on that platform? Which speaks to what you're saying, which is if those platforms were created with business in mind, what would it look like if the platform was created with spirituality, with connection, with wonder in mind?
That's right.
What would our technology look like if those were the things that we were focusing on when we create the platforms?
That's right. Like the Uber car was created with 2 paradigms: economic efficiency. So it wanted to accelerate and brake as little as possible so that it consumed as little gas as possible. So it was economically efficient. And the structure was around the law. So it was like, I want to brake as little as possible and I want to follow the law. Okay, I'm running this person
Feels
over.
like my day some days.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And by the way, Rushkoff's book, if I can hustle him for a minute, that he talks about all this, is called Program or Be Programmed. Because he speaks exactly to your point, Ellie. He says, if you're not doing the programming, you're going to be programmed by the programs that you use. So, you know, as a woman, if you want a space that speaks to you and who you are, you better create it with your fellow women. Otherwise, you're going to be programmed by the spaces that don't have your considerations at heart.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. And I love that because that brings us full circle around to the whole idea of connected capitalism. If we're not saying what our business is supposed to be about, someone else is going to say it for us and we'll be caught up in that work environment. So you're saying that we can play, as you use the term co-create, we can co-create what we want our workspaces and our platforms to look like. And if we base those on Jewish values, on Jewish ideas, what a unique workspace that will be.
That's right. And I would double down in this particular historical moment. You know, we find Jews are finding in general that the expected allies aren't stepping up in the way that they had hoped for. And my response to that is to double down then on us. You know, if our allies aren't stepping up, if their way isn't making life safe for us, then we have to do it our way, explicitly Jewish, which again, reaching out to build connections that way. And that, I believe, happens. Like if you just look at the folks blurbing the book or participate in the book, they're on the left of the spectrum, they're on the right of the spectrum. They're Jewish, Christian, Buddha, they're across the board, right? And that's what we have to do by being Jewish and by embracing our Jewish values. That's our contribution to our shared secular society, not looking for others to set the terms for us.
Beautiful. Wow, beautiful. this is why I love the book.
Thanks,
I
Ellie.
feel so on board with that. Amazing. I would really love if we have a few more minutes to open it up for anybody who might have a question. So if anybody has a thought or a question about what you've heard, please either go ahead and take yourselves off mute. You can use the chat, or you can just raise your hand. Does anybody want to ask a question?
Don't be shy, folks. Co-creative enterprise. Especially if you disagreed, by the way. Tear in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Shy.
Yeah.
So Ellie, it's Ellie.
Hi, Ellie.
I wanted to just mention, you kept mentioning Google. And I have a daughter who's worked there for the last 7 or 8 years. And they are so clever, because they eat together, they go play ping pong together, they do all these things in the building, and they're relaxing, but they're talking to each other. There's always communication. It may be over food, it might be over a ping pong game. Instead of sitting at their desk, they are doing what you're talking about. They're communicating, they're getting to know each other, they're working together. It's such a brilliant concept. And I can guarantee you, knowing my daughter and a few of the people who work there, they put in more time than the average person, because they are expected. I mean, they have very high standards for their staff. I mean, they have very high standards, but they do it in a different way. And it's brilliant. It's just so brilliant. And their staff stay because of it.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that's so interesting how, we can model ourselves after the best parts of things, I think. There's a great question here. Debbie's asking, can you see us moving to a 3-day week?
No, but I dream of it.
Why not? Why wouldn't that be something we would consider at this point, do you think?
So I'll tell you a personal story, right? So, before I went back to the academy, I did consulting for this upstart tech firm that was funded out of the individual CEO's pocket. And that individual looked at Google and said, oh, wow, look how Google do all these amazing things like Ellie suggested. And they're so productive. I want to do that here. And so I was like, doesn't quite work like that. So no, I'm going to look. What did Google do? Okay. Free food, brought in free food. Basketball court, brought in a basketball court, right? Days off, brought in days off. And his inefficient, ineffective, lazy firm became more inefficient, more ineffective, and lazier. Because you can't just plop in the 3-day week and the basketball court and the food and expect that culture to develop, right? It has to be rooted in an authentic sense of meaning and purpose. Googlers, as they call themselves, really believe in what they're doing, right? So are we at a point where across the board, enough individuals so believe in what they're doing that we can cut the physical show up time in half to expect that productivity? Probably not in the near term. Is that the dream over the long term? Absolutely. And where I do become optimistic is as the culture changes, that's when I think it'll happen, because it'll be a natural transition, right? So if it's presented as, well, you used to work 5 days a week, now you work 3, go for it. That won't work. But if we evolve to a place where people are used to giving their all because they feel meaning, connection, and wonder, then we can stop looking at the clock, and then we can be more fluid and flexible and interactive.
Beautiful. I remember having a conversation once, which is really helpful, because you're helping me understand more what I was seeing, which is, if you don't have a clarity as to your goal and your relationship, then your job description needs to be very clear, right? Like the boundaries have to be much stronger if there isn't just that natural flow of working together. But once you have that natural flow of working together, everybody's on the same page, everyone's excited, then you can loosen the job description a little bit, because you'll just work together.
That's right.
So it really speaks to what you're saying, which is, you have to have that kind of relationship first to what you're doing before you can change the boundaries around it in a certain
That's
way.
right. Culture has to come first. And culture is a very, very messy construct. Jay Barney, one of the big names in the management world, father of this idea called the resource-based view of the firm. He liked to say that the heart of a real competitive advantage is if your resources are inimitable, right? Which is that they can't be codified. So culture is the best example of that. So folks would hire him. This is his genius, right? Folks would hire him as a consultant and say, so how do I get that culture? And he would say, if I could tell you, if we can codify it, then it wouldn't actually be valuable.
Interesting.
Right? So his whole hustle was going out there, right? And selling people on the idea that what really makes it work is something that you got to figure out on your own. And what he can tell you is once you have it, nurture it, right? Don't screw it up. Can't tell you how to get to that culture. Can't tell you how to have that relationship. Can't tell you who those stakeholders are going to be. But if you've got that chevra, if you've got that group, if you have that happening, you've got to do what you got to do to keep it together.
And that's so true of community building in terms of like the community is going to have the flavor of all of the spices that are in the community. Right. And you can't really like mechanize that. Like a relationship is going to have the flavor of the two people that are in it. And it's unique to that relationship. So I think that's so beautiful to recognize the organic kind of nature of that. There's a question here from Jackie. How do you expect the true stakeholder who put their blood, sweat, and tears into the business to be equal with the person under them? She says a voice at the table is one thing, but a vote is very different. And similarly, who gets to sit at the table? Not all job positions are created equal.
Right. So that's the Nobel Prize winning question, right? The Nobel Prize winning question is, okay, David, you sat here and schmoozed me about these organic co-creative relationships where we all get together and we love each other and we're free and we forgive. Who makes the decision, right? At the end of the day, someone has to make the decision. We still have
the grown up in the room.
That's right. Who gets to make the decision? But my answer to that, again, driven by current business practices, is that the leader makes the decision. Who's the leader? That's flexible, transient, and fluid. So what we are finding really, for example, is, amongst the big corporations, there's high CEO turnover. Why is there high CEO turnover? Not because of incompetence, but because there's a recognition. You come in, you do your thing, that motivates people, they listen, and then you move on because we need someone else to do their thing to motivate people and bring them in and get them to listen, right? So, am I arguing that there are no hierarchies moving forward? No. Am I arguing that an equity partner, who built her life in this firm should have an equal vote to a new hire? No. Am I arguing that experience doesn't matter? No, I'm not saying any of that, right? I recognize that there's still a need for hierarchy, decision. There's still value in experience. Obviously, someone who, Jackie's terms was blood, sweat, and tears, right? That obviously has value. But flip it around. Who do you become as a result of that? So do you say, I put in my blood, sweat, and tears, I'm a leader, noun, as a noun, I am a leader, listen to me because of all I've done. If that's who you are, you're not going to last. But if you say, I put in my blood, sweat, and tears, I'm a leader, verb, which is to say, I am currently in that act of leading, which I recognize is a relational act. And I recognize I can't lead without your support. Then the question of how much of a vote does that underling get? Well, that the leader, verb, decide. That is leading. Leading is figuring out how much my opinion matters versus my underlings, versus my partner, versus my co-creative partner, etc. That's leading. And I think it's an idiosyncratic decision, right? I think it's case by case. Right. So I think a good leader, verb, would take that question, wrestle with that, and come up with an answer that works for them in their specific context, and will reevaluate that in a different context. So, I'm not saying completely out with the old, right? And I'm not saying everyone matters equally. However, change your paradigm slowly. And that's what I'm advocating. That's what I'm pushing for.
Mm. And the beauty of that is fluidity of roles. And that as a leader, you can sometimes trust your staff, where you can say, I know right now in this situation, they actually might know more than me. And
That's
I'm
right.
going to draw on that and have the ability to have enough flexibility in my own sense of the role that I can empower everyone in the room to bring their best to the table and not feel like they have to do it, so that I still feel like the leader.
That's right. And that's a Chavrusa idea in Judaism. That's the heart of my book is Chavrusa. You know, when Reb Zalman was my Chavrusa, right? He's still Reb Zalman. I mean, he's still up here, right? But in the moment of Chavrusa, we were equal. So, you know, would I, in a normal context, argue with him, criticize him? Absolutely not. In the Chavrusa context, absolutely yes. If I didn't in that moment, then I actually wasn't a good Chavrusa, right? So in certain contexts, I was his Talmud. So at certain moments, you know, and I'll give you, you know, to make the story personal, right? When it came to davening, I was his Talmud. I, to this day, born and bred in the yeshiva system, went through all the way. I still don't, I'm in my 40s. I don't understand davening, okay? Zalman understood davening. He lived and breathed davening. So when it came to the topic of davening, I was his Talmud. He was my Rebbe. I tried to learn from him. But when we were in Chavrusa, I pushed, I argued, you know, and so that was my role, right? That didn't threaten the hierarchy. That didn't mean he wasn't Reb Zalman. That didn't mean he wasn't my Rebbe, right? He created the space where it was safe for me to push and ask. And that's what I would expect of the equity holder who put in their blood, sweat, and tears, that hopefully she earned her equity because she created space for those who helped her acquire that equity and will want to reward her appropriately. You know, in my academic work, I define greed very specifically, right? I said greed is claiming so much value so that others can't claim their fair share. And that's a careful definition, because if you're making $100 million, you're not necessarily greedy, right? If you're making $100 million and everyone's getting their piece, so the person who should be earning 50 grand is getting their 50 grand, person who should be earning their million getting their, that's not greed, right? Greed is when you say, I'm taking so much that the folks who help me earn it aren't getting what they deserve. That's the issue.
That's such a great boundary, a much clearer definition of what that means exactly.
Yeah.
So let's do one last question, and then I think we'll wrap it up for the night.
Cool.
I feel like we could just talk for hours. So hopefully at some point we'll get a chance to do some more of this. Debbie asked a question: how do we get people to steer away from parental expectations and find work of passion? So I think
yes,
it's a great question.
It's a beautiful question. And, you know, I wish parents who don't have Debbie's open-mindedness could spend a day in the shoes of a university professor, because I can't tell you how many heartbreaking moments I've had as a biz school professor, where I've had students come up to me and say, David, here's a problem. I'm first generation university. I'm smart. I'm hardworking. My parents said, oh, you got to go to business school. I don't want to be in business school. I hate business. This isn't where my heart is. But my parents said, well, you're first to university. I'm not going to waste my money on a humanities program for you. It's got to be economics. It's got to be business. And it's soul crushing. And you watch this beautiful kid who came in, you know, with an amazing resume, great high school experience, great, and it's soul crushing for them, and their performance suffers. So, you know, to negotiate that is tough, but it's so necessary. And the onus is more on the parent, I would argue, than the child, right? It's the onus is on the parent to recognize that, you know, their job, their responsibility is to create a loving and supporting environment, which sometimes means being disappointed, right? And allowing yourself to feel disappointed and then forgive and move on. But I'm going to actually say something different. Since this is the closing point, I actually want to say something different that speaks to Debbie's point, okay? Everyone in this room, I think, agrees that right now, the Jewish community is in crisis, that we're finding that the media is against us, rock stars are against us, actors are against us, television's against us, we're very alone. Who's with us? Lawyers and CEOs. Okay. The lesson of this moment is we need to encourage our kids to be rock stars and actors and media folks and writers, so that next time this happens, our people are there, right? I think part of the reason right now we're not finding allies is because our people aren't there. So our allies are in the law firms and in the C-suite, because that's where we put our kids. But if our kids aren't the musicians and aren't the writer, right? Like, in other words, I don't find it interesting to sit and complain about CNN and Fox News and what those reporters are doing. You want something different? Encourage your kid to be a reporter. Right. Encourage your kid to be you don't like, what the rock stars are saying? Encourage your kid to be a rock star. So I think, right now, this challenge doubles, triples, quadruples the message that we need to empower our kids to do what they find empowering to them, what speaks to them naturally, because we need Jewish kids, religious kids, proudly, self-identified kids in every field, so that our allies can learn from their colleagues and not just from lawyers and doctors.
That gives a whole different picture of what light unto the nations could look like that we could really be in so many different environments, in so many different places, that we could affect Tikkun Olam on a scale that is not yet imaginable. So I think that's a great place to end. So
thank you so much for having me, Ellie. This was awesome. So fun.
Thank you so much for joining us, David. Thank you so much. Again, I want to encourage everybody to get a copy of Connected Capitalism. I will send out an email with the link to order it from Amazon. Please, if you'd like to get in touch with David to ask any further questions, David, can I put in an
email? Yeah, my email's on my website. Yep.
Awesome. davidweitzner.com. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And hopefully stay safe, stay healthy, and God willing, we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Good night.
Take care.